Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. In today's episode of How the French Learn Orchestration, we're going to focus on the melody, in particular doublings, whether the unison or the octave. In France, we learn orchestration by orchestrating piano scores. So unlike in America, where many of you are probably used to some kind of score analysis, which is very heady and it's very passive and doesn't actually prepare you for orchestration, in France, you learn by doing. So your teacher is going to assign an excerpt from a chef-d'oeuvre, this is in French, or a masterwork. My preferences for this channel to be focusing on for orchestration in the French style are going to be Mozart, Beethoven, or Debussy, though in the French tradition, you would start with the classical era composers, so Mozart and Haydn, and then you would get to Beethoven, and you move through les étapes, it's in French, through the historical time, and you probably end with Debussy, right? But nevertheless, you're going to be assigned a small passage from one of their piano works, and then you have to bring in an orchestrated version for the next class. Notice that in this method of learning that you do not get some, hold your hand, this is everything you need to know, here is a textbook that's going to give you information. No. You literally have to learn by doing. So it's really, really frustrating. The first time I did it, I was like, my ego was destroyed. I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm stuck. I'm lost. But that is actually how the French learn in a lot of different subject matters. They throw you in, and then your teacher will say, oh, you could do this. Oh, look at you didn't do this. And they find all these faults in the work. It's not a personal thing. It's just they find things that don't work, and then you learn. And you may think, well, I wish I'd known beforehand. But the reality is it just gets too complicated to keep all these ideas. You really have to learn by being put in the battle zone. So let's talk about mistakes in the piano score. There is a reason why I specifically typed this up, a cleaner, nicer version, which I'm about to show you. So if we look at the score, I downloaded it from IMSLP, and we have to be grateful. It's free, it's just made things way more accessible. So I'm not complaining, but when you are going to orchestrate in the French style, probably you're going to be doing something that's in public domain, so it makes sense to go there, but you have to be really careful. So on the screen here, there is a mistake in the piano part. I wouldn't expect you to just know this just by looking at it, because you have to get your feet wet. So probably when you're going to be orchestrating the French style, you do some kind of analysis. You're going to play through the piece, even if it's really bad, okay? My piano skills are atrocious, but still I fumble through just to really get the harmony and the spacing of the chords in my fingers. This is critical when you get to Debussy, where each register, the placement of the chords is just, it has to be preserved. But even in something like CHABRIER, it is still very, very important to really get the sound in your ears and to really know what you're doing, okay? Be careful of just jumping in the orchestration thinking that you're wasting time otherwise. You save time by doing quality preparation. In the piano part, we have, in the right hand, mi, fa, re, mi, mi. First off, this is awkward to play repeated notes on the piano. Prior, we had very fluid lines, scales, arpeggios, so it just feels a little bit awkward. It would be way more natural to do mi, fa, mi, okay? Also notice prior in the piece, we have re, mi, do, mi, re, so we have a similar figure. So just intuitively, I feel this has to be a mistake. Now, one thing to mention is if you have poor piano skills, probably you'll play through the work and you'll stumble through it. And there are certain things like dissonance that sound really bad at a slower tempo, but you just have to kind of re-listen and just imagine the sound at a faster tempo. However, this figure, mi, fa, re, mi, mi, it just has to be a mistake. So what I did is I did some research, I looked at other versions, and I confirmed that it was a mistake. This is really important when it comes to orchestration because small problems become much larger problems later on. It's a problem when you're orchestrating someone else's work because then you're going to have that same mistake in a lot of different parts. I think a problem with a lot of composers, or some composers, is that they just ignore it because they just want to get to the action, which is the actual orchestration, but this is critical. when you're orchestrating your own work, you will definitely have mistakes. There's going to be mistakes because there's so much work, there's so many notes that have to be written, there will be mistakes. One dangerous mistake is what we call copie-coller. So it means you copy and paste, especially if you're working in a computer, okay? One of the dangers, for example, let's say you have violas and it's a G major chord and you have the violas on B and D, okay? Now, maybe you really want them on a G and B and you just put them on the wrong elevation, maybe because you're not used to the alto clef. This will not sound bad in a computer because it still fits into the harmony. Visually, you may not notice it just scanning through, but it undermines all those hours of work that you're listening to the exact intervals that you wanted. So make sure you go slowly. Make sure you investigate when there is a problem because small problems become larger problems very quickly in orchestration. Okay, now we're going to do a harmonic analysis. Notice that we're in A minor. So I have a 5 chord, and then we go to a 1. We do a voice exchange. So we go from root to first inversion. Notice soprano does C-A, the bass does A-C. Okay, something to observe, something we learn in harmony. Next measure, we have a 4 chord. Thereafter, I go to a 6, and I reinterpret the 6 as a 4 in C major. Then we have a 5-6 in C major, and then we have the 1 in C major. This has to be pretty quick for you because you're going to have to fill in the chords. For example, we see that D to the F, that is a large distance that sounds nice on the piano, but in an orchestral context, you're going to have to fill it in. Another thing to keep in mind is notice that we have a 5-6 chord, so that means the leading tone is in the bass, and that B natural is going to have to resolve up to the tonic. However, notice that the pianist is doing do, re, si, re, do in a higher octave, probably because of the register. So you're going to have that fortitude to think, well, probably I need to resolve this in the correct octave. All right, so now that we did that quick harmonic analysis, we're going to get straight into the orchestration. Many times you would plan out the orchestration, but here I want to just get like the essential like mechanics, okay? So we're going to do the outer voices. This comes directly from harmony, and when you are doing orchestration in the French style, it is presumed that you would have had already 3 to 5 years of harmony studies. So you have a bass, and you get the soprano and the middle voices, or you have a soprano, you get the bass, and then the middle voices. This is a basic mechanical skill. It's a thinking process that will aid you enormously when you're doing orchestration in the French style. Let's get the right hand of the piano. So the most obvious place for this is going to be the violins, right? Also, when we orchestrate, especially in the French style, a lot of times we're going to start with the strings because the way the curriculum is built in France, you start with the earliest orchestral works, really. So Mozart, where the strings were like the chord, and then you build successively towards Debussy. And the strings generally are going to have a résumé, as in French. They're going to have a summary of all the musical events. Certainly your own pieces can be different, but it's just a way that we proceed. So a lot of times when we want to get started, we're going to just test it out in the strings. When you get to Debussy, it doesn't work so much in that way. So this works excellent for the violin 1. It's in a great register. It's très commode, as they say in French. It's just naturally, obviously meant for the violin 1. Now, for the violin 2, what does it need to do? Is it going to be doubling the violin 1 at the octave, or is it going to be down the octave? I would prefer to put it down the octave because there's more volume. It's just a more thrilling sound. But the one thing to make sure is that when the violin 1 goes into the staff, you have to already be anticipating that the violin 2 is going to be down the staff and potentially, going, not able to get the note because it goes below its lowest note. Looking on the screen here, I think it sounds fine in 2 octaves, so I'm going to keep it like that for now, though you have to be ready to make adjustments later on. Now I'm going to get the other outer voice, so I'm going to get the cellos, okay? So first I'm going to start with the cellos because they're like, versus the double bass, they can really be independent as a section, and I'll use the double bass to reinforce the cellos. So based on what we have in the piano score, I'm going to put it straight in that lower octave for the cellos. I write it out. I make sure that it doesn't go out of range or there's nothing weird. The first decision I had to make is we talked about that figure do, re, si, re, do in the left hand of the piano. Obviously, it's meant for a different voice. If I were to voice it down the octave in the cello range, it would make sense just from an abstract musical perspective, but it's going to sound really dark and muddy in that register. So just listen to the sound. I don't really want it, okay? But you have to make a mental note. I still have to account for that gesture. Now I need to bring in the double bass if I want the double bass. So my first impulse is to double it down the octave. When you're orchestrating piano scores, it's almost just implied that whatever the bass line is in the left hand of the piano, that it's going to just automatically be doubled down the octave. Now it depends on the situation. When you get to Debussy, a lot of times it's so specific where he places the different instruments that it doesn't work like that. But a lot of times you kind of have to assume that you're going to have the double left-handed piano down the octave because the listener tends to enjoy a really clear bass that has at least 2 octaves. Well, more than that probably gets a little muddy. So I write it out. I make sure it stays in range. Notice that it's at the cusp of the double bass range, so we have that low E, but it works well. Now, a concern I'm having is that the violin 2 and the cellos are getting a little close together. So notice the distance from the cello when it gets high to the violin where it gets low. Now, this is partly built into composition, right? Because you have this descending high line, and then you have this ascending bass line. So at a certain point, it's just what the composer was hearing. But it is something that makes me a little bit queasy. Now I've got the outer voices, which comes, like I mentioned, directly from harmony. So I want to get the middle voice. So that's going to be the viola. So my first attempt is to put them in octaves. Part of the reason is just in the piano score, it already had that upper octave represented. So probably the composer was hearing that. Though you have to really be careful because the piano score cannot be the word of God. Now, when it comes to orchestration in the French style with French teachers, they do treat it like a sacred document, which is why ultimately I think you need to compose your own works because you will have that freedom to do more interpretation. But it could just be what sounded good in the piano. So first, I'm going to see if I can account for this upper octave in the strings. And if I put it in the violas, it is a good register. However, notice that they go above the violin 2. Now, French would say, c'est pas impossible, okay? Which means it's not impossible, it's not offensive necessarily, but it could create confusion for the listener. However, I have to say, if you study the classical era composers, so Beethoven, Mozart, and Haydn, you will see many times they have a triple bass. So you have the violas, you have the cellos, and the double bass, and the violas will actually go above some of the upper parts. And no one would have ever noticed unless you actually analyze the score. So there has to be something to that. Though I think when you're starting out, and especially when you're doing a study, it's better to be a little more conservative with that, especially if you don't have full mastery of the different, of harmony. So that means we have a problem, okay? And we need to come up with a solution, which we'll investigate. So the first solution is we're going to keep the viola where it is. So we're going to have a 3-octave bass, and then we have to adjust the violin 2. Either it's going to have to go to unison with the violin 1, or it's going to have to do some kind of filler or something else. Another possibility is we're going to keep the violin 2 where it is. We have to take out the upper octave for the viola, and we're going to have to do some kind of filler for that viola. That's going to be a little tricky because we already talked about the fact that the distance from the cello to the violin 2 is getting quite tight. Now we're going to get the middle voices. So we already got the outer voices, so we have the top of the chord, so we have the violins. On the top, we have the cellos and double basses on the bottom, and now we want to get the middle, which is viola. This is coming directly from harmony. So just as a reminder, if you were to do orchestration classes in France, your study in orchestration would have been preceded by at least 3 to 5 years of quality studies in harmony, where you're getting out of the voices. So you have the soprano, you hear the bass, you have the bass, you hear the soprano, and then you fill in the middle voices. If you want more information on how harmony directly prepares you for orchestration, I have a 20-minute video that is available for free directly on my website. I show examples from harmony exercises, and I show how it directly leads to readiness for orchestration. In this example here, I have a harmonic reduction. I didn't want to write out all the 16th notes and lose precious time, so I just focus on the essential harmony. So in this particular case, the downbeats are what I was most focused on because those are the true notes, we can say, of the harmony. Notice that we have a voice exchange. So we have a C in the cellos and double basses, and then CA in the violins. So one of the things you learn in harmony is that you want the inner voices en bouge le moins possible, which means when you have a voice exchange, you want the listener to enjoy that beautiful voice exchange between the outer voices, so the middle voices are going to stay as still as possible instead of constantly doing micro adjustments for each change in the chord. From there, I use logical voice leading, so from AE to AD to continue. Right? Another thing when it comes to orchestration of French style, you want your harmony skills to be here because you will have to spend a lot of time planning, deciding the outer voices, deciding what instruments, deciding the range, making these critical decisions. But by the time you get to something like the voice leading, you want it to be boom, 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 boom. Now I want to show you some of the difficulty that you may have when you're trying to do an assignment for orchestration in the French style. So notice in this first example that I circled the second eighth notes for the bass. This is because in the passage of time, here we have quarter notes are the changes of harmony, but the listener is going to actually perceive in retrospect that the lower note of the bass is the true bass. In this other possibility, which is not a good option, notice I circled the downbeats. This would have come from a poor understanding of harmony where you assume the downbeat is going to be the consonants and then the dissonance occurs after the beat or there's some kind of suspension. Yes, in the beginning that is the case, but as you progress, there are more holistic understandings of harmony. In this next example, notice I stuck with the second eighth note is the true note of the harmony. This gives me a clear harmonic progression, so I have a 2-6 to a 5-6 to a 1 in C major. From here, I filled in the viola. Okay, it's on the A and the D, so that D is the unison with the second violin. And then the A is coming from the unison with the cello on the first beat. Then we follow logical voice leading. In the next example, I went back to a poor understanding of harmony where the downbeats are considered, the true bass note. And notice I get a weird harmonic progression. We have a 4-6 to a 5+6, which is the third inversion dominant 7th chord to a 1. It's kind of strange. Notice on the downbeat that I saw the A and the F, and I just assumed, okay, there must be an F major chord, the 4 chord. And so I filled a C and an F in the viola, but then I got confused when the violins went to the D. From there, I incorrectly understood this as a 5+6, so that means the third inversion, meaning the fifth of the chord, is placed in the bass. So I tried to complete it by putting the viola on the F and the G, but then I have this strange jump from C to F to G, so something's wrong in this harmonic understanding. In the first part of this video, I actually incorrectly analyzed this as a 4, okay? Now partly that might have been because I was in a rush, or maybe I was trying to show you the problems that occur when you don't have a good level in harmony. This is one of the reasons why I highly recommend sometimes, finish the piece, get the performance. That eviscerates anything I have to say because that's direct experience. But if you are thinking of orchestrating or you want to start investing in your long term, then start doing quality studies in harmony, which I have available on my website, or you can find elsewhere, because you're going to address these problems directly at the source instead of trying to do an orchestration assignment and getting some confused realization and losing a lot of precious time. Now let's talk about actually realizing the viola part. So in this first example, I have the viola at 16th notes. I actually really like this possibility, though I have questions about stylistic purity, and in France they are very big on that. I have some qualms with that, but to me it doesn't seem like something CHABRIER would have done. It doesn't seem really part of that time period. I could be wrong, though orchestration on its own, I do think it's nice. And this next possibility, notice that I have eighth notes in the viola. To me, it's trop scolaire, so what that means is it just feels like too much like filler. Yes, it is filler, but it feels like you're just like doing the bare minimum to complete the assignment. It doesn't feel right. In the next possibility, notice I tried slower note values. I don't think this solution is good either because we have the violas in a forte passage, fortissimo passage, they're not going to be heard in this manner, and there's no real justification for it. In this next possibility, I tried experimenting with a figure for viola, something else. And I like the concept, but notice that we have a perfect fifth, A to E. So that means they're going to be crossing the string very rapidly. It's going to be very sloppy. And also there will be intonation issues. So I didn't like this solution. If you want to see how CHABRIER realized his own piano work and orchestrated it, I put a short directly on my website, barneyjmusic.com/orchestration. Also, as a reminder, we have an orchestration competition here at Compositions Allies where you can get feedback from myself on your first orchestral work. Make sure you apply within the deadline. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day.